that's here in the chat that's waiting. Thank you guys for joining in. You may have seen this plastered all over social media for you to sign up for our Patreon so you can get an insight on this behind the scenes discussion. This is really a private discussion that I'm giving you guys some peering view into. So that way you can see the kind of discussions that I have with various groups off camera. This is going to be exclusive for Patreon, so it's not going to be public on YouTube. And those of you who've already invested in the ministry via Patreon, thank you for that. And hopefully this is worth the while on top of all the other things that we have. Quincy, you're part of the Patreon. So did you get the chance to get all the things that's posted in there? There's a lot of stuff in there, right?
There's a lot of books, a lot of references, yes.
A lot of references, right? And giveaways where we give away money and all types of gifts and stuff like that. And articles is in there and news information, just tons of stuff that we're going to continuously add to that because we want to continue to increase the value of those who are investing, right? So here, my brother Quincy, I'm going to let you have the floor. I'm going to give you a few minutes. Let me know how this discussion came about. I know we're missing one individual, Tanya, or two people, Tanya and her, you said fiance, right, Tina?
Tina. Right.
So we're missing those two.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So I'm gonna give Q the floor, my brother Quincy the floor, and let him tell us how all of this started. And this is gonna be one of many discussions going forward, right? Because I'm sure not just by them, but other Christians that I know who speak to me, I'm gonna bring them into discussion as well, so we can really get a thorough understanding of this and know how to convey our worldview in juxtaposition against, what the Trinity is, right? So Q, you have the floor, my brother. Go ahead and break down for us how this started, and we're going to take off from there.
Okay. Well, basically, we just have this group which started off with Hannah and myself, just going over scriptures and things like that. And then I had a couple friends, Tina, and there's another friend that she's not on tonight. That were just coming into the truth. I myself has been in probably I would say 2 years, but to make a long story short, we would always have topics for the week to bring up. As we're doing our reading, we would bring something up as far as something that we didn't understand, and we would just reach out to friends that we knew that were in the truth that could kind of help us out a little bit. And the Trinity has come up, and as a subject where I just couldn't, I just couldn't grasp it, and explain it to the group, So I was just trying to find out, how I can get a good explanation to the group, and that's when I reached out to you. Because I've been watching you for about 2 years now, something like that, and I like how you break things down. You give a lot of history, which I love, and I thought that would be good for the group. So that's how it came about.
Well, I'm honored for that, my brother. Thank you for the confidence you have in me. Hopefully I can deliver. I want to give all praise to the Most High Yah for just being a servant, and you called, and if I'm available to help, I'm here. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm a chief servant, and I don't really like the word leader a lot. I think chief servant is better because that keeps you humble. And it keeps you in alignment with what Yah's called us to be, right, to our community. And I think that this is a really, really good subject matter to start off with, because a lot of times Christians will outrightly reject the ethnicity claim and bring you right into the theological argument, right? So a lot of times we can argue from that backwards if they want. But the central focus is, once we get them to understand the identity part, as far as the Israelite ancestry, it becomes a different subject matter, especially if they share the same ethnicity as us. So even in this case scenario, I like to speak to people who are interested, or people who's well studied, and be able to give things that either they're not familiar with or they've heard before, but not from that angle, right? So what I'm going to do real quick is, if you guys have a question or want to interrupt, just raise your hand on the screen. I'll see you and I'll tag you in. I'm going to mute all you guys real quick. Shout out to all the Patreon members that are watching right now. Thank you guys for tuning in. And again, if you guys have any questions, concerns, or input, just raise your hand on the panel. Make sure you keep notes. If there's something you want to say at the end, let me know. And again, I have time tonight. I know there's a 3-hour difference, which is okay with me. I have time tonight. You guys just let me know when you guys need to stop. Okay. I can go as long as you want me to, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours is up to you guys. Just let me know. Okay. When you're ready for me to stop, I'll have the mics open. I'll do a check every hour, and just let me know if you know, you guys want to stop or if you want to keep going. It's up to y'all. I'm here for y'all. Okay. All right. So let's get started with this. So the first thing I want to do is I want to explain what Christology is, right? So logi means the study of, colloquially speaking, and then Christ, which you have to do with the personage of Christ, who's believed to be the Messiah or the Savior of the world in perspective of Christianity. According to Israelite ideology, Yeshua came for the lost tribes of Israel, right? Or even all Israel. The lost tribes, he wanted to regather and bring the two sticks together, like we see in the book of Ezekiel. So according to Matthew chapter 15, we know that he came for the lost sheep of Israel. And then by proxy of that, anybody that cleaves unto an Israelite, they're allowed to partake in some of those benefits. But in the kingdom age, they're going to have to serve Israel, right? And that's a hard reality that a lot of Christians don't like, but that's what the text teaches, right? But we're willing to entertain this idea that Jesus died for the whole world to reconcile everybody back unto God. Like, that is just a way to replace what the original or organic text was trying to convey. Because remember, the people that was writing the text, almost all of them are Israelites writing to an Israelite audience, right? So if a Gentile was to hear it, it was by proxy of them being connected to an Israelite. So all of that is important to note before we even dive into this Trinity. One of the errors of the Trinity that I will say would be the fact that it starts from the New Testament and works its way back. And the reason why is because Christianity teaches that the full revelation or the most pure revelation of the entire Bible comes with the revelation of Jesus, and then through his apostles, and then Paul. And then reading that and understanding them is the best way to interpret the Old Testament, the so-called Old Testament, or the Tanakh, right? And that's error. Like, nobody reads a book that way, right? You don't watch a movie that way. You know what I'm saying? I don't put the movie on and say, all right, let me go an hour into the movie and then say, oh, wow, and then jump all the way back to the beginning. That is illogical, okay? But that's the approach they take. If they did not take that approach, they would not have derived this Trinity idea. Okay. So dealing with Christology, the Trinity developed as a means of identifying the personage of Yeshua HaMashiach, Yeshua Bar Yosef. Some people call him Yahushua, some people call him Yeshaya, some people call him Jesus, whatever the case may be. This historical individual, what happened was after he died, and then, you know, we have the emergence of his disciples becoming apostles, and then Paul coming in later. And then you have your 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, and 4th century church fathers who are leaders, you know, in these developing ecclesia communities, trying to understand who this individual was, right? A lot of them did not understand who he was while he was alive. And then it wasn't until Pothimus, after his death, that they really started to do some retrospective analysis to kind of find out who he was. And it was first laid down by his disciples who became apostles. And then, you know, with Judas being taken off, they replaced Judas in Acts chapter 1. And then later on, we see Shaul come on the scene after he was persecuting the ecclesia, the called out ones, right? Those who elected out from the rest of the secular realm. So now Christology is developing, where everybody's trying to understand who this individual is, and what he did in his life, what did it mean, etc. So when it comes to textual criticism, which is looking at the text and analyzing the text so we can look at various variants between all the manuscript evidence that we have available, because it's not one manuscript or scroll that we have of the Old Testament, or what's called a codex, which means a book that we have of the New Testament. We don't have any of the autographs, which means the things that would have been written by the authors is ascribed to. We don't have that, right? So what we have to work with is fragments, codexes, and pages from other codices, and try to understand, okay, what is all this data that we have, and how can we reconstruct the original from this data? And what you'll see is that between all these manuscripts, which is a wealth of manuscripts that we have, they agree about 90% plus, which shows the veracity of the transmission and the diligence in preserving what they could from what they received, right, when it was disseminated across the known world at the time. So that's why you do textual criticism, to actually look into this. Now, there are things called epsima, vox, and verba. So what does that mean is vox and verba. Vox means voice, verba means words. So when it comes to looking at the life of Yeshua, what a lot of criticists do of the text is look at the things that are written in what we have today as far as the synoptic gospels and the gospel of John, and determine were these things written word for word, which would be verba, or were they written to get the essence of what he said, which is his voice, right? And these things are important because when you determine which is which, it affects your Christological position and understanding who Yeshua is. So textual criticism and looking at the historicity of this individual named Yeshua, the objective is to try to determine, if he lived, which it's a consensus is that he did, and do we have the best representation of him in the Gospels? Okay, and there's arguments that go back and forth on that, right? So again, these things are also important because now when you have the disciples becoming apostles and they're going out, this word about Yeshua is going out. We see in Acts chapter 11, when they're dispersed, they go to their own people in the places that they're dispersed based on the commission they were given from Yeshua. Okay. But now you see incidences like Acts chapter 10, where Cephas or Peter encounters Cornelius and then starts to explain to him this understanding of who Yeshua was, and he's believed to be a Gentile outside the ethnos of the Israelites. And some people may consider him Gentile. Some people say he's not ethnically Israelite. And then before that, in Acts chapter 2, right? Because Acts chapter 1, Yeshua, he goes up. They ask him, when are you going to bring the kingdom? He said, look, it's not your time to know that. What you need to do will be my witnesses, right? And then in Acts chapter 2, he tells them to tarry or to wait in the upper room in Jerusalem. Why? Because 40 to 49 days prior, he was crucified. He was killed, right? So what's the next feast day after Passover and unleavened bread? It's Shavuot, which is 40 to 49 days or 50 days after you have unleavened bread. So the reason why he told them to go during that period of time, because the people, the conspirators that were responsible for working alongside the Pharisees to get him crucified, were returning back to this feast. Because if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 16, it says 3 times a year every man is to appear before the Most High, where he places his name. And then later on we see that place that he places his name is Jerusalem. Okay, so they have to appear back there 3 times, and that is your Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, your Shavuot, and your Tabernacles, right? So the feast days are extremely important, even looking at the New Testament. So now when these people are coming back, they had already killed him 40 to 49 days prior, and then now Cephas, he has the Ruach, and he's able to speak to them. Not what you see in church, the convulsion and all unknown tongues and all of that. He speaks in a coherent form. But he's speaking one way, and it's understood by all these Israelites that are coming from all across the known world, and they each can understand what he's saying. And they're like, wait, ain't this man a native of this region? Isn't he a commoner? How is he able to speak the language that I understand? And then he attributes that work to being of the Most High and not him being drunk, because they say, man, this guy must be drunk with wine. And then he gives a revelation of who Yeshua is to those individuals who only knew him either by hearsay, or maybe when they were in Jerusalem, they may have heard words about him. Some of them may have been healed by him. Some of them may have sat under his teachings and so forth, but they didn't understand Pothimus, what his goal was after he died. So they had to explain it to him in Acts chapter 2, and that's what they did. That's when the message first went out. So it's important because they went out to their people first, and some proselytes and converts that were along with these Israelites or Jews that came along there. So now they're getting an understanding of who this individual is, right? Who's this guy, right? This is before Shaul comes on the scene. This is before we get any of the gospels that are not written to after the destruction of the temple. All 4 gospels were written after the destruction of the temple. Paul's epistles were written before the destruction of the temple, and the other epistles, whether they're general epistles, or other writings like Revelation and so forth. All of these things were done after the destruction of the temple, which is important to understand. So Shaul's writings is the earliest we have, and the book of Acts is the earliest history we have written of everything that transpired. And according to Shaul's words or Paul's words and Lucas's words or Luke's words, is that they were both companions. That means they knew each other. Luke understood everything from him following Paul, and Paul got his knowledge from the apostles, Barnabas, and other individuals that he had encountered. Okay, so again, this is understanding who is this person. Christology is being able to understand who is this person, who is this person, who is this person, right? So this thing starts to develop over time. So now we get to the point where Shaul gets into the mix. They don't trust him because he persecuted, the early ecclesia, called out ones. I'm very careful using that word church. I like to use the word that they use there in the Greek, which is the ecclesia. And then he's persecuting them. He goes on the road to Damascus. He's interrupted. He gets a revelation. He goes to Barnabas, and he gets the scales removed from his eyes, and he then subscribes to Yeshua. And then he has to go back and prove himself, right? Because they're kicking against him. And then he was commissioned in Acts 15 to go towards the Gentiles, right? So all of this is important because, again, this thing developing. Now, remember, Yeshua was supposedly have died approximately 33 AD. This is what they say, right? We don't know for certain if it was exactly 33 AD, but we know it's around that time period. And the reason why is because the way chronology is done with the AD was something that was a later invention. Okay, so we don't really know exactly when he was born and exactly when he died, right? Because at that time they were using the Julian calendar, not the Gregorian calendar we have today. They were using the Julian calendar. So now after, Shaul gets the word and, the apostles are giving out the word, then Paul is killed. Some other the apostles are martyred. You have the destruction of the temple, and then more of them are martyred after that, right? And then now we get to the point where the gospels are being written, right? After we have Shaul's epistles in circulation, then the gospels are being laid down. Now, according to academia, something called the marking priority is the consensus today, which is the book of Mark was written first. There are different ways to determine that. When we look at Luke and we look at Matthew, there are other ways that we see in the narrative that are, yes, hold on. Sure. Go ahead, Tina.
Can you hear me? Tanya's asking if we're still on the call. So I want to text her, but I have to text her from this phone. Just heads up. And now I can't hear you. Sorry.
Hey, Ron.
My bad. Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you
now. At what point did that happen?
Now back.
Did you hear everything so far?
Yeah. Just when she said something, you that's when we can hear you.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So you were at about Matthew as far as
right.
That's where Matthew.
All right, I'll get back. All right, cool. All right, so while we wait for Tina, Tanya, and her fiance, I'm gonna keep going. So the marking priority is pretty much the consensus in academia now, which is the book of Mark was written first. There's different ways that they use to determine this. One of those ways is looking at the areas in which Mark, Matthew, and Luke agree, and in what order do they agree. And there are times when Matthew has parts of the narrative that Mark doesn't have. Mark is only 16 chapters, is extremely short. Matthew is much longer. Luke is much longer than Matthew. And then we have the book of John, which comes much later, right? So there's various ways. There's the Q hypothesis that's created. There's the M and L hypothesis, which means these are other sources that Matthew and Luke source from. So there's places that Matthew and Luke agree, and that narrative is not in Mark. And they believe that that came from an earlier source that they pull from. But then there's places where Matthew has part of the narrative that's not in Luke and Mark, and they believe that's the M source. But there's places in which Luke and Matthew agree, right? As far as the narrative, they say that comes from a Q source, which is qual, which means just a source. It just means source, right? And then there's places that Luke has narratives that we don't see in Matthew and Mark, and that over here is called the L source. So we have the M source, the L source, the Q source. which is pulled, Matthew and Luke pulls from. Then we have this source over here, which is the L source that Luke pulls from, or Luke has, that's distinct from Matthew and Mark. And then we have the M source that Matthew has, that's distinct from Mark and Luke. But then it's places that Matthew and Luke agree with Mark. And through a deduction, we were able to tell that Mark is earlier. Now, there's other ways to look at it. We look at variants in regards to the narratives. And typically, when you have a much shortened form of a story or narrative, it's believed that that is the earliest form. And then when you see things are added to the story, that's believed to have been done much later on, right? Depending upon the scribe, the audience, etc. Right? So that's just giving you an overall understanding in regards to textual criticism of these manuscripts. All of this is important because now, by the time these things are being written down as autographs, after 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem is sieged by the Romans and so forth, and we have the Arch of Titus in 85 AD, where they're showing all the items being brought out from the temple. Now there's a situation where they thought this was the end. They're like, yo, the temple's destroyed. We know, and we go to Matthew 24, he's telling them they want to know the sign of the times and the end of days and all that. And he starts telling them all these things. He looks at the temple. He says it's going to be a time when not one stone is going to be unturned. So now they're writing back in hindsight the things that he had shared with them in order for them to fully understand his mission and all the other events that are going on in their immediate environment. So a lot of times when people read the text, they tend to negate what's going on in the immediate environment, the context, the history, and even the natural environment in which things are occurring. And these things have to be taken into account to see its bearing on why the authors are writing things that they're writing. Okay. So when we look at this, we see that this is a phenomenon, understanding that now they're laying down their understanding. So when we're looking at how things tend to develop, and I put this out in my lecture that I did as well, that I shared with Q, and I think he shared it with the rest of the group. Hold on, I think. Oh, here we go. Is that Tai Tanya? Oh, they dropped off. No. Who's Tai Tanya, Q?
That's Titania.
Oh, Titania. Okay, got it. All right. She looks like she was in, but she dropped. So hopefully her and Tina comes back. But I'll keep going until they come back. All right. All right. So in understanding this, we know that now they're beginning to lay down from hindsight, retrospective, their walks and dealings with Yeshua. Now, mind you, these traditions have been going out orally for a long time before it got written down. The reason why it's proposed that they wrote it down is because after the destruction of Jerusalem, they're like, man, we about to be dispersed as a group. We're being persecuted. We need to lay this down on some kind of text and disseminate it, right? So that way the world knows what happened here, because we know we're under pressure from the Romans and getting more strict on us. So we have to write this thing down and disseminate it as fast as we can. When we go back and analyze the manuscripts that we have of the Gospels, we know that Mark being first, and then you have Matthew, then Luke, and then it's proposed that John was last, and the epistles of John, and then the book of Revelation, right, when he was exiled to the island of Patmos, right? So now all these things are laid down to understand who Yeshua was. In hindsight, this is important. The earliest elements of the New Testament we have is from Paul, and Paul never walked with Yeshua. It's believed that he has gotten revelation from him. That's how he got the understanding, but he never physically walked with him like the other apostles did, all right? Hey, Tina.
Hey, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Perfectly. The
Okay,
sister joined in. Oh, there she go. She's back. Hold on.
Yeah, she's trying. She didn't have any sound.
Okay. Are you there, sis?
Can you hear me? Hello.
Oh, yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm good, and you?
Finally. Sorry that took so long.
No, you're fine.
It's okay. Ministry calls, right, Titania? So we understand.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Will it just be you?
I can't see her.
Yeah, I don't think she's showing the camera on her face, though.
Okay,
oh yeah,
okay.
no, because I just woke up not too long ago. Y'all don't want to see that.
It's all good. We understand.
I can't hear her voice though.
You can't hear her? Well, can you hear her, Hananiah?
Yeah, it's kind of spotty.
Can you hear her, Tina?
Yeah, it's crackly, but I can hear.
Yeah.
Oh, I
Okay.
can't hear.
I can hear everybody.
Yeah, and I can hear you perfect, Tatiana. So,
Okay.
will your fiance be joining us as well, sis?
No, he's at work.
Is that work? Okay, no problem. So we're gonna this will be recorded so you can share it with him once we're done. And
Okay.
this is gonna be one of many discussions. So even if you missed this one, when we do future ones, you can join in.
Okay.
And pretty much what I'm doing right now is just giving an overview, right? And just laying some foundational things first before we really get into the meat and potatoes of it. What we covered pretty much was the definition of Christology, and I explained what that was, which is, the study of Christ. And then we're getting, looking at how the development of Yeshua being alive and then his successors and, the things that they wrote down. I went over to manuscripts. We don't have any of the autographs that was originally written by the apostles. All we have is a copy of a copy of a copy. And there's a reason why that happened. And I didn't get to that point yet. But I was pretty much explaining, how do we know that the book of Mark was written first? And how do we know that the writings of Paul was before the Gospels and so forth? So I was just covering some basic fundamentals first before we really dive into the meat and potatoes. But you can always go back after we're done with this session and check that out because it will be recorded. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. And if you have any other questions, I can't see you. What I was telling the panel is that they can raise their hand, and if I see them, I can let them tune in. But what I would doing is I'll be doing a check-in maybe every 20 minutes to see if anybody has any questions as we go on. You can stay on as long as you want. All of y'all can stay on as long as you want. If it's agreed as a consensus that we should end, let me know, and then we can just do part 2 at another time. Okay.
Okay.
All right, awesome. So what I'm going to do is put you on mute real quick, sis. I'm going to finish where I was at. Mute, and mute. Okay. All right. So, Q, can you, I need you to be my spot checker. Where did I stop? Where did I stop off at?
Well, you were still going to go into Matt. You were going into Matthew, and then that's when she came back. So just go ahead and start back. Where you were talking about the book of Matthew and how you're going on with that one. So
okay. All right. So getting into that. So what I was pretty much saying is that since we don't have none of the autographs, we have to use textual criticism to reconstruct what the original says. And there's tons of fragments and codexes or codices, which means a book. To be frank, and people don't really know this, in Hebrew, when we read anything that says the word book, that is called a linguistic gloss. And what that simply means is that you are adding a modern word to an older word, right? And that's what's called semantics, is when you attribute a meaning to a word and what the range of meaning can be for a particular word. So when you see somebody say the book of Isaiah, the book of Jeremiah, books didn't exist during that time, right? The word sefer really means scroll. It doesn't mean book. You don't get books until the rise of Christianity, and you get what's called a codex. And these things were made differently. You had vellum, or you had lambskin or leather. And then you had these pages that was inside of them, right? These papyri that was folded inside of them. And it was different types of codices. But you didn't get that into Christianity. Prior to that, that didn't exist. Everything was in scroll format or inscribed somewhere, which we called your inscriptions that they would have on artifacts that we find today, whether it's pottery shards, right, which is called ostraca, or whether it's on a wall relief, or whether it's on some kind of papyri document or a scroll. So I just want to explain that books didn't exist during the time of the Old Testament, right? We only get that even after the New Testament is written. So while the New Testament is being written, they didn't even have books either. Everything was scrolls or papyri that they had, or things of that nature that was folded up and that was utilized, right? So now we're looking at how the understanding of Yeshua was being laid down by the writers of the synoptic gospels, which is Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And they're looking retrospectively because, again, after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and the scattering of the Israelites, also the Yahudim, or the Jews, now they're saying, wow, we got to put this stuff down so that it, what we remember can be recorded in the event that we're killed off or we're further dispersed and separated from each other. And this is what inspired them to lay it down after the destruction of the temple, when prior everything was oral tradition. Okay. And you'll also see these things in Paul's writings in regards to oral tradition. So I want to give you a particular term that I think is important to understand. And that term is called a kenosis, Kenosis. Okay, kenosis. And you're going to see that when Paul talks about Philippians chapter 2. And we have to deal with the kenosis because that deals with Christology, and the Trinity is birthed out of Christology, right? Understanding who Yeshua was by people who are either writing in hindsight or people who are late to the party trying to figure out who this guy is. Okay. And again, Christianity errors because it reads the understanding of the Bible from the New Testament backwards. And like I said earlier, you wasn't here, Tatiana, when I was talking about nobody starts a movie that way. Nobody looks at a movie an hour in and just say, oh man, this is going on. Let me jump all the way back. You know what I'm saying? Nobody does that with books or anything else, right? It just so happens that the Bible is the only text that people tend to do that with. You know what I'm saying? So kenosis is important. We're going to get into that, the self-emptying of Yeshua, and then also the oral traditions that Paul said that he received, because the epistles of Paul is the earliest elements of the New Testament. And his stuff was laid down before the destruction of the temple, and he wrote epistles, which was then disseminated to the areas of the known world at the time that he had traveled. And then Luke, or Lucas, was his traveling companion, and Luke also wrote a gospel based on the knowledge that he collected from Paul and the other apostles in hearsay, right? And then also he added the book of Acts, which gives the history of the ecclesia, which is those who are called out. Instead of the word church. Church has a different connotation to it, and even its denotation, I think, doesn't fully express what the ecclesia was, right? These called out individuals that didn't have these buildings that they would go to and worship. They would actually really do things at home and underground places because they were eventually being persecuted, right? So wherever they went, they were that body. It wasn't a building that they went to. So when you see the text says, fail not to assemble yourself, they're not talking about no church building. They're just talking about a group of believers coming together. It doesn't matter where you're at, right? So that's also important. So in understanding who Yeshua is, we look at the Paul's writings, which we get is the earliest, and Paul's theology. Paul has a particular distinct theology or Christology, which seems to differ slightly from what we get in the Gospels. And there's a great book that's written on that I recommend people get all the time. And again, I'll share it with y'all. If I don't think I've shared it with y'all, but it's called Pauline Christology. All right. And in Pauline Christology, the author, Professor Gordon, he lays down and pretty much goes through almost all of Paul's epistles and extracts what his theology is, the distinctness of his theology, right? Which sets him apart from his peers, which would be the other apostles. And that's important. So being that Paul's is the earliest writings, we have to extract what we know historically from what Paul recorded through oral traditions that he said he received. And then things that he gathered either through revelation or through contact with the other apostles. Okay. And then after that is the destruction of the temple. Then we have the synoptic gospels, then the gospel of John, and then the epistles, which are written all after the destruction of the temple. So everybody's trying to figure out who this person is. So what we tend to start happen now after Acts 11 is that Gentiles now start to try and entreat and understand who is this person that these people are willing to die over, that they're willing to be persecuted over. This guy that we heard that committed some kind of capital punishment, capital crime or capital offense, and he received capital punishment. And now these people are following after this guy. And they're saying that this guy, he was buried and he resurrected after he was killed. Like they want to hear more about who this person was because they didn't understand it. Now, because of Greek philosophy that was still eminent during that time or prominent during that time, the Hellenized individuals was always keeping the ear open for some new doctrine that would come from someplace and want to get the information and just have endless philosophies over it. And if you want to say that word philosophy, philos, is the word for love or brotherly love, more particular, and Sophie comes from Sophia, which means wisdom, right? The love of wisdom. So they was looking for any piece of wisdom they can get. When they found out that these apostles and then Paul was sharing this information about this guy who was a criminal, right? Who died by crucifixion. When you crucify, you committed some kind of capital offense. And now you're talking about he rose from the dead and y'all willing to give your life giving out this message under persecution. So that was extremely intriguing to the Hellenized world at that time. And they wanted to know who this person was. So now you start to get these Gentiles, these outsiders that start to come in and want to really try to find out who is this person that you guys are talking about, right? And this is when we start to get the development of, what's believed to be the Trinity. So what I'm going to do in this segment, because this is a lot of stuff to cover, I'm going to deal with the references in the text, and I'm going to show you the development of Christology and how some of these things start to give birth to what's called the Trinity. So the Trinity in a nutshell, and I'm going to be oversimplification what I'm about to give to you, because they make it much more intricate than what it should be. But an oversimplification in regards to defining what the Trinity is that God is an essence, okay? And that essence is expressed in three distinct persons who are co-equal to each other, who are co-eternal, and each have a role in the redemption of mankind, okay? Again, one essence that's expressed through three distinct persons who are co-equal, co-eternal, and each have a role in the redemption process of man, and each who have a relationship prior to the creation of the world and a relationship that's demonstrated after the fall of mankind, right? So the two ways that you look at this, according to the Trinitarian perspective, is you have the economic Trinity, which is the role of these three persons in the history of mankind and redeeming man back unto the divine. And then you have what's called the immanent Trinity, which is the relationship of these individuals outside of the scope of the historical aspect of redemption. Okay. And this is the way that this is categorized today by scholars in the modern world, right? And again, they lean off of the development of this Christology through what they call Orthodox Christianity, which is a form of Christianity that took some time to catch hold. And the early church, so-called church, or ecclesia called out ones, from the 1st century up into the 4th century was like the Wild Wild West. And you had some individuals that were striving to create an orthodoxy that is a standard method of beliefs, and anything outside of that was considered heresy, and they would be denounced, and eventually they would be persecuted, which is interesting because those early believers were being persecuted by the Roman Empire. Okay. And then now you have these Johnny come latelys that are coming on the scene with their Greco-Roman background, trying to understand the person that they never lived with, right? That they've never been in contact with, that they're only getting hearsay from, right? Rumors from. And then some of them encountered the apostles, like Cephas and like Shaul, that they may have known firsthand, that we start to see some of these 1st century patristic, leaders, whether it's the synop or the bishop of Rome. And then we have, bishop in other areas as well, in the area of Turkey and so forth, or these leaders. The bishopric started to occur after the death of all the apostles, where you have this major leader in these different cities that are carrying on the mantle of the apostles after they died off, right? Most of them were persecuted with the exception of Yochanan. He's the only one that's believed to live until he died of old age. All the rest of them were martyred. Okay. So in understanding this, the Trinity doctrine, again, is from people who are coming into understanding Yeshua with the Greco-Roman mindset that has already been predisposed with Platoism, with Stoic cosmology, Aristotelian substance, metaphysical knowledge and understanding, the Hegelian dialectic, historicism, and all of these things that they already have in their mind before they get into the text. And on social media, I made a post where I started to explain these things, right, and show these things based on an author for Logos. Logos is the software company that makes this interactive Bible application that I have. I don't use it as much anymore like I did in the past. But they had a blog, and on their blog, they have some of their scholars write things in their blog. And he pretty much broke down that Platoism, is pretty much what inspired a lot of these early church fathers and their understanding of, who Yeshua was, and then taking that knowledge and expressing it to a Hellenized audience. And when you look in the works of Philos, who was contemporary almost to Yeshua, Philos himself was a Hellenized Jew that lived in Alexandria, and he looked at the philosophy of, Hellenism, and he kind of took the Torah understanding and Hellenized it so that way the pagans the country dwellers, those outside the urbanization of where the state-sponsored religions and the state was established, trying to convey to them this understanding of who this person Yeshua is. But Philos himself was not a believer of Yeshua being in Alexandria, but what he did was started to do things that was then later borrowed by Shaul or Paul, and him disseminating information from the Torah to a Gentile audience. And then what we see later on in the book of John, right? We have a prologue in John chapter 1, verse 1 to John chapter 1, verse 18. And that prologue is something that's outside of the narrative that pretty much is supposed to predispose you before you get into the narrative of who Yeshua is. And the reason why it's believed that prologue was added either by John late in his life or by the Johannine community, the community that he kind of inspired, was because they were going against the Gnostics and the Gnostic community, which believed that Yahweh or Yod-Heh-Wav-Heh or Ahai, or whoever you want to call him, Yah or Yahu, was a distinct deity from the real deity, which was Yeshua, who appeared as if he was a fleshly being, but was really a spirit, because he couldn't be fleshly because the flesh is bad. Sarx in Greek is bad and spirit is good. So he really looked like he was a physical man, but he really wasn't. And he is the revelation of the hidden God. That's the real one that's benevolent, the one that loves mankind, distinct from Yahweh or Yod-Heh-Wav-Heh from the Old Testament, who's really to be a dictator, or whatever the case may be. So that's Gnosticism. So you have that prologue that's designed to be there to dispute the Gnostics. Okay. And when we look at the other things that was coming on, what's called Jewish Christians. So the so-called Jewish Christians are the Ebionites, because Ebonim is a Hebrew word which means poor ones, right? And it seemed to have been, sourced from the book of Psalms, where either they called themselves that or they were called that by the church fathers who wrote about them, because we don't have any autographs from them. None of their works really exist. Anything we have from these so-called Jewish Christians would be from the church fathers' writings themselves. But what's distinct is that these Ebonim, or these Ebionites, and then the early Nazarenes, and then the sect of the Way that we see mentioned in the book of Acts, and so forth. All these individuals kept the law and subscribed to Yeshua, but their Christology was considered to be a low Christological view of Yeshua, which means that it's Christology from the ground up, right? Instead of Christology from the top down. Right. So it was the bottom up and top down. Well, what does that mean? It means that they believe that he was born of a man and a woman, consummating, bringing him forth, and that at some point in his life, namely the baptism, is when he received the fullness of the Ruach, which made him divine and be able to carry out the law in its perfection and be able to teach and perform his task all the way until he was crucified. And that's called adoptionism, right? Or dynamic adoptionism, which I'm going to get in. So my subscription, and this is me putting it on the table, and I share this with my Christian associates or whoever, is that I subscribe to most, not all, but most of the Ebionite perspective of Yeshua, because these were Israelites who, some of them lived during the time of Yeshua, some of them lived during the time of the apostles, some of them existed afterwards. Okay. And their understanding would be similar to what these other Yahudim or Jews would have believed during that time. Okay, so that's my position, where I say that Yeshua was born of a consummation between a man and a woman, which brought him forth. And in bringing him forth, from the time when he was brought forth to the time he was baptized, why he pressed John so much to be baptized, because he was being taught by the Father. He wasn't given his assignment yet, but he was being taught by the Father. Up until the time of his baptism, he knew that he had to be baptized in order for him to be initiated with the Ruach or the Spirit or Pneuma, in order for him to complete his task. And that is when he received his divinity, from my position. Now, because I'm having an objective conversation, I don't want to insert a lot of my personal beliefs, but I'm just being frank up front and saying that's what I subscribe to. Right now, there's some people who are Israelites that believe in the virgin birth, some that don't believe in the virgin birth. Most of Christians believe in the virgin birth. I haven't really found too many Christians that don't believe in the virgin birth. But that's also important when we look at the development of the Christology. right? So according to I would say critical historians of the New Testament, what their proposition is that number one, they don't speak about miracles, and they cannot condone the resurrection, right? Because these are things that they can't prove as a historian. So they kind of parse that stuff out. What they do deal with is that they said that his followers, Yeshua's followers, after he died, it was their belief that he resurrected and he revealed himself to them and he commissioned them to go and continue on with his mission that was cut short because of his crucifixion. Because of that, these people were empowered to move forward with what we call the gospel. Okay. And the intention of it was to reach the Israelites first before going elsewhere. All right. So again, looking at the Christology is understanding the person of Christ is that while he was here, he initially came to his own people. He came to them first. That's who he was there talking to. That's who he was there giving the promises to. That's who he's there saying that he came for them. Okay. And as a result of his mission of giving this gospel to his people, he encountered Gentiles who he then, because of their faith, honored their requests, but he never gave them the gospel, which is interesting, because it wasn't intended for them at that time, at least people would say. All right. So going into the development of understanding of who he was, the historicists say that after his death, because of his resurrection and ascension, that's when his his followers fully understood that he was divine at that point, initially. Because remember, when we look at the Synoptic Gospels, when they caught him and arrested him and was about to persecute him, it says all forsook him. That means all his apostles, the apostles who was the disciples, later on become the apostles, they all forsook him. They all left. And they abandoned him when he was by himself. Because if they believed truly everything he came to do, they would not have left him, but they all abandoned him, right? And then you have Yachanan, Miriam, two Miriams and Yachanan, or Martha and Mary and Yachanan, that then show up at the Stauros, which is the upright stake that he was crucified on. Some people say, oh no, it's a cross. That's another discussion for another time. They actually showed up, but he was already dying at that point. Okay. And they didn't really understand, because after he died, they went back to their normal duties. If you go to Yachanan, John chapter 21, they went back to do their normal duties after he died. And at this point, they went back to fishing. You know what I'm saying? After he died. Because if they fully understood what he came to do, what he commissioned them to do, they would have continued on with their assignments. So it wasn't until he died, was buried, resurrected, and appeared to him that they saw him as being truly divine. Even though we have some elements of the text that's showing these insights of divinity, they didn't fully believe it until after his resurrection. Now, what tends to happen is now they are speaking about their experiences, is going out as oral tradition. Paul, when he's converted, he's taught this by Barnabas, revelations from Yeshua himself. And then he goes and he preaches a high Christology. Why does Shaul preach a high Christology, which is Christology from the top down, which means they believe he has a pre-existence before humanity, before the earth, as opposed to him coming into the world as a mere man and then elevating to divinity. So you have a divinity that's pre-existent, that's coming down as a man, and then you have a divinity that starts off as a man that's working its way up to divinity, right? So these are the two, contradicting things that were going on during that time. And then the Gnostics was just saying that everything that you perceive wasn't even real. He wasn't even a man at all. He was just always this spiritual being that came to reveal the hidden God that nobody knew about, because Yahweh was some kind of destructive God, right? So this is understanding the Christology that's developing during this time. And this is what is taught in Christianity, right? So you can know objectively what's going on. But then when things started to get written, like after he passed, the oral tradition that was going around, because your oral tradition comes from social memory, remember things better. When there's a group of people who experience an event, come together and talk about it, it's better for you to recount certain things or details from the event. And then you put that into an oral tradition, and then you pass that down and make sure that multiple people know it. So through checks and balances by 2 or 3 more witnesses, you're able to better recount what occurred. Okay. So when they started to look at it and say, wait a second, we got it wrong. Like, he wasn't divine because, he had died and resurrected and reappeared to us. He was baptized. Remember that time when John baptized them? Yeah, he submerged them. And then we heard about some spirit that came down like a dove, and some voice opened up, said, "This is my son who I'm well pleased." Yeah, that's when he received the Ruach and became divine. So now these Ebionites and these Nazarenes and the people of the way started to ascribe the notion that his divinity came through his baptism, and that's when he was adopted as the son. He wasn't the son pre-existent. He was adopted as the son at that time. And this is what these Jewish Christians held. But then as time progressed, now we have an addition to the book of Matthew and Luke. Remember, I told you Matthew and Luke came after Mark. Mark doesn't have a virgin birth story. Mark doesn't have a nativity scene. Mark doesn't have any of that. It starts with him coming on the scene as a grown man, okay, getting baptized and then starting off his mission. So that is believed that during that time, that's the earliest belief of the Jewish Christians, is what we get the opening of the book of Mark. That doesn't have a virgin birth story, okay? And that's important. So now we have a situation where now they push back his divinity from his resurrection now to his baptism, to now we start to get Matthew and Luke written down, where we have now this virgin birth narrative. Now, what's interesting is these Jewish Christians had a version of the book of Matthew, and their book of Matthew stopped after the genealogy, and it picks up in Matthew chapter 3, like Mark begins. So all of that virgin birth story and that narrative, that wasn't subscribed to by the earliest so-called Jewish Christians. They didn't have that perspective because they didn't believe in a virgin birth. And that narrative part was just rumors, according to them, right? It was nothing that can be substantiated, okay? So all of that is important, understanding who Yeshua is, because he's the son. And that son becomes divine, or is divine, or what's his divinity. They're trying to work this thing out. So now when we get to Matthew and Luke and this addition to that element with the virgin birth story, now it's like, no. He's not divine because of his resurrection or because of his adoptionism as a son through baptism. No, he was divine before that. Now he wasn't even born of a real natural father. The Spirit gave birth to him. The Spirit impregnated Mary, and then Mary conceived. And now that starts to create other doctrines, such as the Immaculate Conception, which means that Mary was abstained of all sin so she can give birth to a sinless man. Now you start to have other doctrines that start to get birthed out of that. Okay, which actually the Roman Catholic Church today, or what we call RCC as abbreviation, which they hold to today. Okay, all of this is important to understand who this person is. So now we got the virgin birth, and now people says, oh, but he's God the Son. He's God the Son. It's like, no, the text never calls him God the Son. It says the Son of God. When you hear God the Son, it's a play on the Son of God, but it's a play on with implications of a pre-existent nature of this individual. So don't let people say, oh, he's God the Son, and then show you references for God the Son where it says Son of God. Say, whoa, wait, stop them. Say, wait, you're talking about two different things here. Okay, let's define these terms. And I'm going to give you something very important if we go back to scripture. Watch this. Let's go to Mark chapter 1, verse 9 to 11. Because some people say, yo, Divine, you giving us all this information. Where the scriptures at? Okay, let me give you all the scriptures. All right, let's go to Mark chapter 1, verse 9 to 11. I'm going to bring it up on the screen so that people can see it. So just give me a second. And then I'm going to go over a couple of scriptures, and then I'm going to stop this session. I'm going to check in with you guys. But let me check in with y'all real quick. Are you guys, let me bring Tina back in. Are you guys okay with me keep going, or you want to stop here?
Just let's go for like Hannah, we say about 10 more minutes, and then
okay,
we can stop there.
All right, so I'll deal with the Son of God declaration, and then from there I'll pick up next time for the transfiguration, and then we can go from there to the exegesis of these passages, more further exegesis of these passages. So 10-15 minutes by 12:20 a.m. my time. I think that's 9:20 your time, Q.
Right.
I'll be done, okay? All right, Tina and Tanya, you guys okay? You gals okay?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Mhm.
All right.
I got a quick question.
Sure.
Okay, going back to the baptism.
Yeah.
You said that when the Spirit entered into Yeshua, that wasn't the point to where he came divine, and the Spirit that went into Yeshua was Israel, correct?
You said was what?
Israel.
Was Israel?
Mm-hmm.
No, so what I was saying was the Jewish Christians, and one of the earliest beliefs in regards to Christology is that adoptionism, that's what it's called, or dynamic adoptionism, was when Yeshua was baptized, and is at that point when he received the Ruach, he became divine.
He became divine.
And that's what the
Oh,
early
that's
Jewish
their
Christians believe.
that's the Ish's belief. Is
Yeah,
what
so
you're
the
saying?
Ebionites, the Nazarenes, the sect of the Way, these groups, they subscribe to the fact that he became divine when he was baptized with the Spirit. And then, as you can see, what develops later on is that other sects start to say, no. His divinity happened at birth. And then there's others that say, no. His divinity happened before he was even born. He was a pre-existent entity that was with the Father. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show how these things, these ideas started to arise, right? From the written text, things that we get outside the text, right? So
Right.
I was just outlining or explaining what my position is so that people are aware of it, but it has no bearing on me objectively teaching this. I'm trying to give you all the insights to the subject matter, and you can choose whatever you feel is the revelation that is given to you. But I just wanted to be frank in regards to what my position was.
Okay.
And
Which
I can
is
explain it further as we continue to dialogue.
my understanding that it's two separate entities, not one.
Okay, I mean, we can have that discussion later, but what I simply wanted to do was just show you historically the various Christologies that was springing up and why, right?
Okay.
So in regards to what my personal description is and yours, we can definitely have a dialogue on that. But I also just want to objectively show you guys how these different ideas came about, who held them, what sects rejected them, what sects accepted them. And with this information, you guys can choose whatever position you have. Either it can strengthen your position or continue cause you to consider another position. But I just want to kind of cover that. And the sources I gave to Q, touches on some of this. And then I have more sources I can give you guys to read up on everything I'm talking about. So you can have it there in written format, right? So you can actually read it and make notes in it and everything like that. So I'll make sure you guys get those books as well. So anything that I say, if you make notes and you may have missed it, you can go back to the video and get it again, or just look at it in the books that I give. All right. Now, Q, since you're on Patreon, there was a book that I posted up about Jewish Christians. I don't know if you've seen that book on there. Yeah, and that book is a really long book, right? It's like 400 something pages, I think, or whatever, maybe longer. But it goes into what we were just talking about, Hananiah, in regards to the adoptionism ideology by the Jewish Christians, right? And that was their prescription. Right now, this is not for I'm not telling nobody what to believe now. I'm just simply giving you the history of the Christology so you can understand how the Trinity develops, right? From out of this understanding. All right.
Okay.
Does that work, Hananiah?
Yeah, fair enough.
All right, awesome. All right, so I'll mute you guys real quick. You said I got 15 minutes and we breeze through this real fast. All right. So let's get Mark chapter 1, verse 9 to 11. Actually, do I want to do Mark? No. Let's do virgin birth first. Okay. I want to touch on something in regards to the virgin birth, right? Luke chapter 1, verse 35. That's what I want to get. All right. Luke chapter 135. I'll bring it up on the screens. Give me 1 second. All right. Luke chapter 135, right? So in the book of Luke, what we notice is that in this, let me bring it up on the screen. My bad. Let me show y'all on my screen so y'all can see it. There we go. Right. So when we get to the book of Luke, this is a situation that's written as a nativity narrative, and even pre-nativity narrative before Yeshua comes on the scene. We have a situation where Luke chapter 1 is used to create the doctrine of immaculate conception, in which Mary was absolved of all her sins and declared righteous, so she could be sinless and give birth to a sinless man, which would be Yeshua, Jesus Christ, or whatever, right? So what I'm showing you here is that a lot of people refer back to this and say, you see, he was the Son of God before he was born. And they quote Luke chapter 1, verse 35. Again, this is the angel coming to her, or the Melech, which is a messenger coming to her, giving her this revelation that what she conceives is going to be set apart, and it's going to be the Son of the Most High. Okay. But here's the interesting thing. Okay. When we get into where it says, I'm going to show you in English and then talk about it in the Greek as well. Let me bring up the Greek on the screen real quick. Let me break it down right here, and we're going to get into it on the screen. So what we want to look at is this term right here. Okay. This term right here, kalea or kaleo, right? And this is also something that's used in regards to apologetics, right? But that we could talk about another time. This word is extremely important because when you parse it out, right, it's in a future tense. That means it's talking about something that will happen, that has not already gone. Passive voice, right? Because it's saying that this is going to happen to the subject that we're talking about. The mood is indicative. Now, when you go into, like, some people may not be able to look at this right here in its form here and break it down by looking at the suffixes and how it's put together to parse it out. Anybody interested in learning some basic Greek, let me know. I can give you some great sources, great academic videos to watch. But when we learn about how this is written third person, we're not worried about that. Number singular, we're not worried about that. The important thing we'll look at is the tense, right? The tense is extremely important in the Greek because people will say he was called the Son of God in Luke 1:35, and that's incorrect because the Greek does not agree with that. It's in the future tense, right? We can look at the declensions of the verbs, right? Or the suffixes will help to give us insight into what it is that we're looking at. The root word here, kaleo, which is here. And this is the word right here, okay? And this is just suffix here, which gives us more information on what we're doing to this actual verb. And then if you look here, you see some differences here in the verb as well. All of this gives us more information as far as person, as far as gender, as far as tense, mood, etc., right? But when we break it down, we see that it's in the future tense. And if you go here to blueletterbible.org, you can also click here on the Greek verbs and Greek grammar, which is great sources that they have. So you can kind of break this down, even if you're doing a word study, which goes against the notion that at birth he was called the Son of God. No, it's saying that he will be called the Son of God. Some point in the future of his life, he's going to be called the Son of God. And at what point do we discover that first happening? When he's baptized. That's when we discover that. So the understanding, even if this oral tradition that was then penned down by Luke, the people who subscribe to the adoptionism would say, yeah, he was called the Son of God because when he was baptized, a voice opened from heaven and said, this is my beloved son who I'm well pleased, right? That's when the adoption as a son took place. So we have to look at the virgin birth of them saying that what's going into Mary is not from man's seed, but it's actually from the Ruach HaKodesh, or from the Hagios Pneuma, the set apart spirit, Holy Spirit, that is actually impregnating her, and it puts the man out the way, which is interesting because then you have to explain, how is he the son of David? How is he the son of David if you're getting rid of the man element? When we look at the genealogy of Luke, it goes back to Adam. When we go to the genealogy of Matthew, it goes back to Abraham. And then there's some differences in the genealogy. Some people say the genealogy of Luke is really talking about, Mary or Miriam, and the genealogy of Matthew is talking about Joseph or Yosef. And then there's irreconcilable differences between elements of the genealogy, which is also looked at by academia. And that's something we could talk about another time. What I'm simply showing you is that this is a proof text that some people use to say that his divinity can be, brought back to his birth, because here he's called the Son of God, which then Christians will say, see, that's God the Son there being called the Son of God. And they'll take it there. The pre-existent element doesn't come into play until we get into Paul's writings, which we're going to get into on our part 2. We're going to get into Paul's writings. I got a few more minutes. Okay. So I just want to show you this because when you get into the language, I tell people all the time, the best way to understand the Bible is learning the language and the culture. And then you look at the language and culture and how it develops over time, the chronology of the development of the language and the culture that's being used to express the record that we have today, trying to understand with our contemporary minds what was done during that period of time. And you have to flush out your contemporary understanding, presuppositions, predispositions of what you think is going on, and go back to the customs, the manners, the historical context, the language, and learn from the ground up. And that's the best way to truly put this text in its proper perspective. So with 5 minutes left, I'm going to stop there and I can continue on in our next session. But if you guys have any quick questions about anything I talked about, let me know and I can address them real quick. We got about 4 minutes. All right. So I'm going to open up all the mics. If somebody has a question, just let me know.
I think with me, I'm going to have to go back and like listen again, you know, because like you said, it's a lot of information.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of information. And but I see what you're saying as far as looking at, you know, the language, the culture to understand it. But it's kind of, you know, still being new to it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's kind of like, you know, it's kind of hard for me, you know.
But it's okay. If you have any questions, though, that can help to simplify it, then let me know and I'll just answer the question direct, right? Without going on a tangent or giving a reference, I could just answer it direct. So that way you have it as a point and then you can move to the next point, the next point, the next point until you actually grasp it. So do you have any general questions about anything that we covered so far or just in general that we may cover in the future? And I can give you a good point of reference as we move forward. Go ahead, Tina.
I have a question. Yeah, I have a question for, this is a longer conversation than to answer it tonight. But when we were talking about the Trinity or the false Trinity, my question came up in Genesis when God says, let's create man in our image.
Correct.
The first question that came to mind for me is, who is he speaking to?
Correct.
To make God in our image.
Correct.
And so I did listen to the videos that Quincy sent me, 3 of a kind or one and the same videos. And so that has helped me to kind of understand it, but I want to make sure that what I heard in the video is correct.
Sure.
Which is that there are other powers that are in heaven with Elohim, and the conversation was being had with those other powers, the divine council, in that conversation, or was El or Elohim or the Most High speaking to someone who was his single individual counsel, like a wife? So it was a little confusing. There was a couple things in there that.
Gotcha. Yeah. So just so we can see, like I brought it up here.
All of that.
Yeah. And all of that is great. And these are the questions that we need to ask. I heard you, Q. I didn't hear you at first. That's why I went to Tina, but I'll come back to you. So hold your question. I'm gonna answer it real quick, okay? After I address Tina. Is that okay, Q?
Oh, go ahead. All
right. So what I want you to see is that's why I said looking at the grammar. Vai yomer Elohim na'ashe Adam be zal menu. So this right here, the word we're looking at. So nu is the suffix meaning our, right? So we have various things here. Ne ase, right? The making of Adam, of man, in our image, right? So again, we have vai omer, which means and you know, Elohim, because in Hebrew the verb comes before the noun. So this is the verb here, Omer, and it says, and he said, and then we had the word Elohim, which is the plural. Na eseh, let us make man. This is plural, possessive, right? Let us make man, or Adam, be zal menu, in our image, and it says kid mo tenu, the new again, after our image, after our likeness that we say, right? So when we're looking at here, people would say with the Trinity, say, look, that's Jesus, that's the Holy Spirit, that's God talking to each other. You see, that's the Trinity proven right there. And the problem with that is, if that's the case, every time we see Elohim, is it supposed to let us, and sometimes we say gods or God or whatever, is it supposed to denote the Trinity? And the problem with that is that in the Iron Age period, anybody that would have been talking about this, sharing this, would not have saw this as no Trinity, right? That didn't exist. So what I was simply trying to explain, the book of Job, which is believed to be one of the earliest books of the Tanakh or the Old Testament, because of its archaic idioms, and uses of grammar, which is older than what we see here in the Torah, the first 5 books, or what's also called the Chumash, where we get in Job, where the Most High and say, well, where were you when I laid down the foundation of the earth, where the Son of God was praising and the morning stars sang out, meaning that there was an audience there while he was building, while he was making the earth. After he made the earth, then he made everything else, right? To inhabit the earth. He created an element, right? So the substance was there. He separated various elements in the sky and the earth and the sea, and then he populated everything as he's separating them out. So there was an audience already in existence while he's creating. So when he says, let us make man, I'm saying that Elohim is a collective now that is that we then see when we look at the na'aseh, meaning let us make man. You have the noon prefix, which gives us the us. Let us make man, Adam, in our image and after our likeness, right? So this is him speaking amongst the council, which is other entities that were there that he's always supreme over. He's the creator of all these entities. He's the creator of everything. But he's speaking almost like in third person, right? Let us make man, right? So the entities was just there to view, but because it's a collective now, everything he does, all of creation has to get in line with it. This has nothing to do with the Trinity at all. When you learn the language and the consistency of how language used in the book of Genesis chapter 1, you'll see Genesis 1 and 1 is a collective now, like the word team or corporation. It's a team, which is a plural now, but you use a singular verb to explain what they're doing as a unit. And there's always a head of the team. There's always a head of the corporation, right? And that would be Yeshua. He created it. He's the founder. He established it, and everything that he does, even if it's the work of his own hand, the rest of the team, the rest of the corporation has to do in conjunction with what he's accomplishing, right? So this has nothing to do with him having a wife. Now, that element has to do with the word Pokemon from Proverbs chapter 8, or wisdom, where wisdom says that I was a master workman by his side. Oh, he had a wife by his side? No, that's just the feminine element of the creator that is speaking out, right? It's figurative language. It's not meant to be literal. It's figurative language, right? But then we see in a text where he has feminine traits and masculine traits, which would make sense because if he's creating man in his image, male and female, he has split up the attribute that he possesses in man, puts them in man, puts them in women. That's why when they come together, they become echad, they become one, and they reflect the image of Yah together, right? So hopefully that begins to answer your question. This is not a Trinity proof text. When you learn the language and the history, you see that concept did not exist during this period of time. And this is referring to what's called the divine council, where there was other council members that were there that Yah had already created. They were already in existence before he started to create the earth. At what point did they come into existence? We don't know. The text never tells us. But we know from him dialoguing with Job that they were already there while he was creating the earth. So they would have been present while he was creating mankind as well.
So that other deities,
other lesser deities that he created that are subordinate to the Most High, correct? And this has nothing to do with a son there and the spirit kind of like on the side. That none of that wasn't the understanding back then. They understood that the Ruach existed, like we seen earlier. If we jump up further in Genesis, we see that the Ruach does exist because it went over the waters, right? The spirit of Elohim went over the waters, right? If we go into the text here, we'll see that, which is Ha Ye Ta. This is Tohu Va Bohu, right? So we get to see Va Ha'et and the earth. Ha Yeta was without. Then we have Tohu Vabohu, without form, and it was void. Veha, this is To Shik. And then we get Al Penai, or on the face of your Te Chayon, right? So over the face of the water. So that Ruach did exist. So the Ruach was there. We're here. There, Ruach, right here. And the spirit of Elohim, it hovered over the waters, right? But the earth was without form, void. Darkness was over the face of the deep, is saying, and the spirit. So the spirit of Elohim. So this spirit is there. And the question would be, well, what is that spirit, right? Is that spirit an extension of the Most High? Is it the Most High himself? What is it? And as we go into our dialogue, we're going to see, according to what is there in the textual data that we're looking at, is being expressed, and then what develops later on in the understanding of the Israelites as they get to the prophets, you know, go from the rudimentary period, leaving out of Egypt, from Egypt being a judges period, from the judges to the monarchy, from the monarchy, singular monarchy to the split monarchy, and from the split monarchy into the exile. Like the understanding of these things start to develop over time, and then post-exile, coming back from 70 years in Babylon, now they're reestablishing things. Now we have strict monotheism, right? So we see these things develop over time. We're looking at the text objectively, but none of this that we're reading in Genesis 1 is a proof text for the Trinity at all. And if Christians say that, they are in error. All right. So Q, let me take your last question. Hopefully that was enough for now, Tina. We can divulge later on. What's your last question? Quick, and
No, Tina knocked it on the head. That's exactly what I was kind of leading to, because that's something that we were dialoguing with earlier. You know, one of the questions that we want. But yeah, she already asked that.
Correct. Now, also, Q, since you're part of the Patreon, and for you guys as well, I'll extend it as a courtesy. I have a biblical Hebrew course, right, which is for strict beginners, okay, which is an academic series of videos that's being taught to a audience that knows nothing about Hebrew, and a ton of other resources, a workbook that goes along with that, and other resources that go with that. So if anybody that's listening, whether it's you, Q, Hananiah, you know, Tatiana, your fiance, you, Tina, if you guys don't already know the Hebrew but want to get into Hebrew, let me know. Email me. I'll send you that source. But because Q is already part of the Patreon, he can get access to that as well. And this is why learning the language is good, whether it's Hebrew and Aramaic for the Old Testament, or Greek for the New Testament, or Syriac, which is another language type that evolved from Middle Aramaic for liturgical purposes and written purposes. I don't know if you've heard of the Peshitta before. The Peshitta is a Syriac version of the New Testament, right? And it's believed that that Syriac tradition preserved a lot of the Aramaisms, or the Aramaic that would have been spoken during first century CE, is preserved in the Peshitta, which is a Middle Aramaic language. Okay, so I teach like biblical Hebrew. I'm intermediate in biblical Hebrew. You know, I know some Greek, some Syriac, some Ugaritic, and learning all these languages. And Koine Greek, I know some, but it's like really complex. I prefer like Eastern languages. But learning these languages, when you go back and look at these things without the English, you go back and look at these things without the English, there's a lot of things that you begin to discover that wasn't there before. You're like, wow, I didn't know this. Wow, I didn't see this before. And I'm here to help. All the sources I have, all the resources I have is all you guys. All you gotta do is ask. I'll give it as we're talking. If I've mentioned a reference or something, or even if I'm talking about like breaking down a language, I can give you a grammar guide, right? So you can fact check everything that I'm saying, right? Because I don't want to mislead anybody, and I'm only here to give you the tools, and what you do with it is on you. All right. So I'm gonna close out with that. I'll do a quick prayer with y'all if y'all are okay with that. Okay.
Yes, sir.
We'll close out, and Q, you can reconvene with the group. Let me know when the next time everybody can get together and we can do part 2. Okay.
Okay.
All right, thank you guys. So let me go ahead and do a quick prayer with you guys, and I'm gonna close y'all out. And I want to say thank you to all the people in the chat that joined in from the Patreon. You guys are getting exclusive behind the scenes look into these private conversations that I have with people on the side, kind of equip them so they can go much further along their journey. I'm just here to objectively give them the tools, and it's up to them to subjectively apply it to get further along in their relationship with the Most High, and then effectively affect their community constructively when they apply it in the real world, right? You have to yield results. That's how you know what you're doing is correct. Okay. So with that being said, Almighty Yah, we come before your throne to say thank you for another day and opportunity, Yah. Thank you for allowing this word to come out, the information, even though it may be immense. Please give the mind of discernment to all the listeners that are listening right now so that they can process it, they can digest it, and then it can be a part of their soul, of their body, of their mind, and their essence, Most High Yah. Give them this knowledge so that it can equip them on their journey as they accomplish any tasks and assignments you've given to them. And along that path, anybody who is a dissenter, who is an opposer or opposition, we can give them the hope that's in us with fear and trembling, Most High Yah. I pray that the references that they also receive, you will go ahead and prep their minds to also take in that information, Yah. But most notably, Yah, we want this to arise a thirst after your word, a thirst after relationship of you, to seeking your face, Most High Yah, and refraining from your hands, because when we seek your face, we receive what's in your hands, Most High Yah. And what we want to receive, Yah, is the plentifulness of your word, of your essence, of your spirit, of who you are, Yah. We want to be in your presence. We want your provision and protection and everything that you have for us as Israel, Yah. And we want to be the light as the moon to reflect the sun, which is you, onto the other nations, to draw them to you through our works, Most High Yah. We love you. We thank you. We honor you. Praise you, Most High Yah. We pray that your presence will be with the listeners as they depart from this discussion, and that, Yah, when they come back, they will be even more thirstier than before with questions and inquiries and input, so we can grow as a team in learning more of you. Thank you, Yah, for this time that you've allotted us to learn, to grow. We pray that you are sanctified and make it kodesh and set apart. And we pray that it's a sweet smelling aroma unto you, Yah, that it can be received. We love you. We thank you. Honor you. Praise you. Name of your son, we pray. Hallelujah. All right. So thank you guys for joining in. I appreciate all of you guys. Hannah and I, he
you.
dropped off, but we'll reconvene again. Q is going to be the point man. So he's going to be the coach. So he's going to get your guys back together. You let me know when's the best time, and we'll dive into it again. All right, family.
All right, that's it.
All right. Love you
Right.
guys.
Thank you.
All
Guys
right,
again,
Thank you.
okay.
All right. Shalom.
All right, shalom.
Shalom.
Shalom. All right. So to those who are still watching from the Patreon, I want to thank you guys for tuning in. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this behind the scenes discussion. I'm going to put more like this on Patreon so I can give you your money's worth for your investments into us. Hopefully this conversation was able to enlighten those that heard. Like I said, it's a tremendously immense study. I chose not to do a formal PowerPoint presentation because I wanted to be organic. And I've also spoken on a lot of this in other lectures that I've done in PowerPoints. But this one, I want it to be organic. I want it to be dynamic. I want it to be interrupted and just this flow with where everything is going. But there's a lot of grounds that need to be covered, and I'm gonna do my best to cover it. And so when you dialogue with these Christians, man, these eruditious Christians, right, that got the Trinity down packed, you get an understanding of what they have and how it developed, right? You can go back to the root of it, because that's the only way you can really, convince them otherwise, is if you do a root cause analysis and understand where this thing came from. Okay. And you have to uproot it in order for you to really get it out of their spirit and really give them from better sheet to that point. And that's the way that the Ruach from the Most High, from the Father, intends for us to receive. All right. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you guys are Patreon, which you should be, if you got this link, stay tuned. We're going to do the part 2. You guys definitely going to check it out. More and more information will come out. If you want any references to anything I spoke about, again, let me know in Patreon. I'll be sure to give it to you guys. And I love you guys for your support and for all you've done to make this ministry what it is and keep me accountable. And I'll speak to you guys again. All right. Shout out to Big Main, Millie Love, Yesha Moore, Christian Mayfield, Kanisha Morgan, and the Black Harib in the building, and those who probably are watching without saying anything. I love you guys, and I'll speak to you again soon. All right. Peace and shalom.